Welcome back, capital F football fans, to the O&O Sports YouTube channel. Today we deviate a bit from the beaten path to talk about something that is very, very important to us here at O&O Sports, and it's honestly been something that's bothering me for a few days now, and that is, of course, the EA Sports College Football 25 ratings release from the past week. If you haven't heard, it is time to emerge out from under your rock and rejoice because EA Sports is in fact releasing a new college football game this month. And while that is very exciting, I am not excited about the ratings that EA released alongside the inevitable college football game. These rankings went over a few different things, and today we are focusing on the defensive rankings. So today, we here at O&O Sports have got you covered. We are releasing the definitive top 10 defenses for this upcoming season, and we'll talk a little bit about where we think EA went wrong in some of those rankings. And in doing so, we're going to take a look back at 2023 and talk a lot about returning production, specifically from the starters for each team for this upcoming season. Now, before we jump right into that top 10, a few honorable mentions to go over. At 13th, we have the Alabama Crimson Tide. This might feel a little bit low, but if you look at that secondary depth, they've had a lot of transfers out this year. Going to be a little bit of a rebuilding year. Obviously still super talented. We think EA has them a good bit overrated at 4th. We are obviously very, very off there. And for good reason. If you look at those returning production stats, they aren't that good. And after Alabama, we have the Tennessee Volunteers. Another big disagreement here because EA did not have the Tennessee Volunteers ranked at all in their top 25. The running theory here at O&O Sports is that they just completely forgot about Tennessee, and how could you? Tennessee, one of the most prolific teams in the sport, year in and year out. We have them ranked 12th, just outside that top 10. And at 11, we have the Utah Utes. This one is a little bit closer. EA has them ranked 10th. We think that is just a little bit too high. Utah is a very good defense. 11 is nothing to sneeze at, but just outside the top 10 nonetheless. And to start off our top 10, we have the Nebraska Cornhuskers. We're starting off with a bang here. Another team that EA did not have ranked in their top 25, and we feel like that is just absurd when you look back at the numbers. In 2023, they were 7th in opponent rushing yards per game, 37th in opponent pass yards per game, and 9th in opponent yards per game, as well as 5th in opponent yards per play. Very, very dominant numbers there. A very underrated defense. Just flew under the radar because of how bad that offense was in 2023. They were a borderline top 15 defense. You could argue definitely top 15, even maybe top 12. Last year, and they returned almost all of their starters on defense, along with retaining their defensive coordinator and a majority of their defensive staff in Tony White and others. If you were not paying close attention, Tony White got a few head coaching offers in this offseason, but Nebraska chose to give him a raise in order to keep him on the staff, and that should prove very beneficial to that defense. And as for the returning production, we have 211 solo tackles, 37.5 tackles for loss, 16 sacks, 9 interceptions, 42 pass defenses, 3 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries, and 0 touchdowns. Those are very, very good numbers. And if you look closely in this rating system, you'll see some teams may have better stats that are ranked lower, but we are taking a few other things into account, like those 2023 numbers. If you return a lot of production from 2023, it's going to help you in this rating system. We don't want to just base it purely off of returning production, but we feel as if that is the main thing we're going over today. So just keep that in mind going forward. And after Nebraska, we have the reigning national champion, Michigan Wolverines. Now, in 2023, Michigan had the number 1 overall defense. I feel like it wasn't that close. There were a couple good other defenses, some of which we will go over in this ranking. But in 2023, Michigan was 6th in opponent rush yards per game, 2nd in opponent pass yards per game, 1st in opponent yards per game, and 4th in opponent yards per play. Now, this drop might feel a little bit disrespectful due to the fact that they literally won the national championship last year, but when you consider they lost a good bit of that coaching staff, and considering the volume they've lost, they're still very impressive overall. Nothing to sneeze at all. It'll be interesting to see what changes to personnel and scheming that the new Michigan defensive coaching staff brings to the table. But as for returning production, Michigan is returning 171 solo tackles, 33 tackles for loss, 18 sacks, 8 interceptions, 22 pass defenses, 3 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, and 1 touchdown. Now, EA agrees with us a little bit. They have Michigan ranked 7th. We're going to have them rated a little bit lower, but we agree that Michigan probably isn't going to be the number 1 defense again this year like they were last year. And at number 8, we have the Clemson Tigers. It feels like Clemson has consistently had an elite defense for the better part of the last decade. And every year it feels like they can have a top 10 defense. But as of late, it feels like they've underperformed a little bit, at least on that front. It could be due to coaching. It's just not easy to tell at this point. There's a lot of issues with Clemson that are primarily off the field. They still have a lot of talent, but especially this year, they're going to have a lot of depth issues, and that's because they don't go into the portal. You can't lose 8 to 10 players a year on that defense and then bring in freshmen and expect it to be a very good unit, or as good as a Florida State even, or a Miami. But regardless, Clemson is going to be a very talented team this year. That is why we have them at 8th. And in 2023, they ranked 27th in opponent rush yards per game, 12th in opponent pass yards per game, 11th in opponent yards per game, and 12th in opponent yards per play. And as for returning production, they're bringing back 177 solo tackles, 43 tackles for loss, 15 sacks, 7 interceptions, 24 pass defenses, 4 forced fumbles, 4 fumble recoveries, and 2 touchdowns. And we do have them a bit lower. We feel like EA is overrating them a bit. Those returning production numbers are great. The numbers last year were pretty good, but we do not think they are a top 5 defense this year. Instead, we have them at 8. Once again, nothing to sneeze at. There's going to be a few teams that flip a little bit from lower in the top 10 to higher, opposed to what EA said. And speaking of which, number 7, we have the Georgia Bulldogs. Now, it is heating up, folks. You won't find many publications who believe that Georgia doesn't have a top 3 defense this year. We are one of few, and we'll get into the reasons why. That staff is going to be that staff. They're going to get the most out of their guys no matter what. But in terms of returning production, in terms of talent, in terms of how good they were last year, we just don't see them as a top 3 or even top 5 defense this year. Despite that, Georgia will perennially be a national championship favorite for the foreseeable future. Kirby's going to have this unit in a good spot, but there is a lot of inexperience, especially in that secondary. Last year, they were 16th in opponent rush yards per game, 9th in opponent pass yards per game, 8th in opponent yards per game, and 10th in opponent yards per play. Very all-around defense. Arguably a top 4 team last year, but they lost at the wrong time, so they did not end up making the playoff. As for returning production, they returned 188 solo tackles, 28 tackles for loss, 13.5 sacks, 7 interceptions, 24 pass defenses, 3 forced fumbles, 1 fumble recovery, and 0 touchdowns. EA has them ranked 2nd. We believe that is just too high. We do believe there are better defenses out there, though. And one of those is going to be our number 6 ranked Florida State Seminoles. It feels like after the 2023 season, a lot of people have written FSU off, but not us. They do lose a lot, but they do return a lot, and not a lot of people are talking about it. This defense, Norvell and Adam Fuller, are loading up, could be as good or even better than they were last year, especially that front 7. There's a lot of experienced talent returning on that front, and that is exactly what you like to see. In 2023, they were 61st in opponent rush yards per game, 16th in opponent pass yards per game, 31st in opponent yards per game, 23rd in opponent yards per play. Now, these numbers look considerably worse than some of the other teams on this list, but down the stretch, they were playing like an elite defense. I believe if you take the stats from those final 3 or 4 games they played, excluding the bowl game, those numbers are much, much better. And as for returning production, they returned 182 solo tackles, 49 tackles for loss, 19 sacks, 2 interceptions, 42 pass defenses, 6 forced fumbles, 4 fumble recoveries, and 0 touchdowns. And we have them ranked 5 spots higher than EA does. EA had them at 11th, just outside the top 10. We believe that is underrating them a considerable amount. And if you've seen our Florida State season preview, you know that we think Florida State is being heavily underrated this year. And for good reason. At first glance, they do lose a lot, especially on that offense, but they do return and gain a lot. And for the most part, we see them being overlooked a good amount for this upcoming season. But fear not, Seminole fans, we have your back. And coming in at the number 5 spot, we have the Oregon Ducks. Now, Oregon loaded up this offseason. This is going to be a bit different from the rest of the rankings. They were a pretty good defense in 2023, but they add so much talent. They already had a lot, and they add so much talent, especially in that secondary. They might go from a pretty good defense in 2023 to a very scary one, potentially top 5, and that's where we have them. In 2023, they were 10th in opponent rush yards per game, 65th in opponent pass yards per game, 21st in opponent yards per game, and 22nd in opponent yards per play. Pretty good numbers there, but when you look at the returning production numbers, you might have to play this back just to get a good grasp at where they are this year. 297 solo tackles, 50.5 tackles for loss, 20 sacks, 11 interceptions, 16 pass defenses, 2 forced fumbles, 1 fumble recovery, and no touchdowns. Absolute monster numbers there. We'll have to wait and see how they scheme it, how they load up that front, what kind of looks they give offenses. So we are, in fact, rating them a little bit lower than what EA has. EA has them at 3rd, and that makes a lot of sense to us. I can understand where EA is coming from when they rank Oregon in the top 3. Number 5 is, of course, not bad at all. Very good. I think I would consider the number 5 spot an elite defense. And coming up after Oregon at number 4, it is the Penn State Nittany Lions. At times last season, it felt like Penn State was simultaneously very underrated and very overrated. James Franklin catches a lot of flack due to the fact that he just can't seem to win the big ones. But all things considered, that defense was very consistent, and the offense really is what held Penn State back last year. And the defense succeeded despite that, and statistically, they were just outright phenomenal. 1st in opponent rush yards per game, 11th in opponent pass yards per game, 2nd in opponent yards per game, 2nd in opponent yards per play. And they carry over a great deal of returning production from that team last year. 231 solo tackles, 37 tackles for loss, 16.5 sacks, 8 interceptions, 18 pass defenses, 6 forced fumbles, 5 fumble recoveries, and a touchdown. Now, considering how elite that defense was last year, we find it very peculiar that EA has them ranked 9th. We have them 5 spots higher at number 4, and for good reason. That Penn State front 7 is going to be scary. The secondary is borderline elite, if not just flat out elite, and those linebackers are also very, very good. Overall, sound unit. They do lose Manny Diaz. He is now the head coach for Duke, so we'll have to wait and see if it was Diaz who had them playing up to their potential. But if we had to guess, the loss of Diaz won't hurt too bad. Penn State has had a very good defense to top-end defense for the past few years, so that is why we have them ranked 4th for this upcoming season. And at number 3, we have the Texas Longhorns. Now, this might sound like a little bit of overrating, but considering that the Longhorns are insanely talented and have added crucial pieces with a lot of experience and volume to this point, we think it is a very reasonable ranking. And they gave up a lot of big plays through the air in 2023, and they have addressed that. The secondary was the biggest reason that Texas gave up those plays in 2023, and they quickly flipped that unit from a weakness to a strength via the transfer portal. And they have a lot of returning production on that unit. That unit overall was pretty inexperienced, pretty young, but regardless, they add a lot of depth and they add a lot of talent. And really the only reason they're not higher is because we need to see that secondary settle in. Like we said, they are much more talented. They have much better depth, but they were straight up bad at times last year. So we will have to wait and see and get a definitive answer on that before we feel comfortable ranking them any higher. Potential top 1 defense if that secondary plays to the level that we think they could in the year 2024. As for 2023, they were 3rd in opponent rush yards per game, 105th in opponent pass yards per game. Like we said, just not good numbers there. 28th in opponent yards per game and 35th in opponent yards per play. As for the returning production, they returned 237 solo tackles, 48.5 tackles for loss, 27.5 sacks, 3 interceptions, 29 pass defenses, 2 forced fumbles, 4 fumble recoveries, and no touchdowns. And as opposed to EA, who has them ranked 8th, we have them ranked 3rd. And into the top 2, at 2, we have the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Notre Dame felt pretty underrated all around last season. Not a lot of hype around that team, but Marcus Freeman has them in a great spot. We feel like the reason they were a bit underrated is because Sam Hartman underperformed a bit last year. They could have been a playoff team. That defense was elite in 2023. If you look at the numbers, 27th opponent rush yards per game, 3rd opponent pass yards per game, 7th in opponent yards per game, 6th in opponent yards per play. All around amazing unit, and they return a lot on that defense. 222 solo tackles, 34 tackles for loss, 16.5 sacks, 12 interceptions, 31 pass defenses, 5 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, and 2 touchdowns. So much to work with. Marcus Freeman has to be over the moon with the level of talent, the way they've been able to recruit on that defensive side of the ball, and with how well they've schemed thus far in his tenure. And we feel like EA is underrating them a bit. They have them ranked 6th. We feel like that unit is much more fundamentally solid. Elite at every unit, pretty much. Xavier Watts is a very underrated safety. We feel like he could be in the running for that Defensive Player of the Year caliber season that we've said some others might be in store for also. He is just as talented as a Caleb Downs, but with a lot less hype, and it makes sense. Alabama was a playoff team last year. Notre Dame was not. So you're not going to get the type of coverage that a Caleb Downs does at Alabama last year and Ohio State this year. And speaking of Ohio State, at number 1, we have the Ohio State Buckeyes. Now, this is not really a huge surprise. They were an elite unit in 2023 that feels like they've somehow massively improved this year. Ryan Day must feel a lot better going into this year than he did last year. Regardless, Ohio State felt like a playoff team going into last season, but really they were just held back by mediocre quarterback play in 2023 because last season that defense was outstanding. They were 25th in opponent rush yards per game, 1st in opponent pass yards per game, 3rd in opponent yards per game, and 3rd in opponent yards per play. And with the returning production, just brace yourself, folks, especially if you're from Ann Arbor, Michigan. 257 solo tackles, 42 tackles for loss, 18 sacks, 5 interceptions, 31 pass defenses, 6 forced fumbles, 5 fumble recoveries, and 2 touchdowns. Just obscene numbers there. And this is the only spot where we agree with EA. EA has them ranked 1st, as do we. And that is going to wrap up the definitive top 10. Let us know where you agree, where you disagree. If you think EA had a better list than us, if you think we had a better list than EA, we want to hear from you. Be sure to drop a comment. And if you enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like and subscribe, share with all your friends, share with your mama, papa, whoever it may be. It helps us out a lot. And be sure to tune in later this week for another upload. And hint, hint, the definitive top offenses might be coming next week. Stay tuned for that. Turn that notification bell on. Do all that good stuff. And we will see you then.